afternoon, as the case may be. Welcome to this week's Global Christian Perspectives with me, Chris Eyre, Elgin Hushbeck, and Tony Mitchell, joining me from the left-hand side of the Atlantic, and Elgin on the right-hand side of everything else.
If you have a map of the world according to Australia...
True enough, true enough. Right, number of items. The first thing that I wanted to mention was Elgin, Trump. Is this God's judgment on America?
Could be. Although I would say you could say the same thing about Hillary. I mean, well, I'm not in love with either one of them. I think it's actually I think Trump is a reflection of the period. There's just a lot of people who are very angry that I think both parties have been ignoring the American people for a long period of time, and I think, unfortunately, I don't support Trump, although I'll almost certainly vote for him. Yeah, I think this is just a reaction to people who are fed up. One of the things you get when you talk to Trump supporters or you listen to Trump supporters is there's a very palpable sense of anger. They really want him. I mean, you talk to them, it's not that they support what he says, and a lot of them don't like what he says, but they believe he's going to go up there and do something. They're tired of people making all kind of promises when they're running for office, and they get up there and then they don't do anything. And I think you see this on both sides. I think the left is fairly disappointed with what Obama's turned out to be. The right is certainly disappointed with the fact that they put Republicans in power in the House, and then they say, well, we only have the House, we can't do anything. Then you put them in power in the Senate, and again, nothing but excuses. They don't even get bills onto the president's desk, and then there's just a lot of anger out there, and I think Trump is very masterfully tapped into that anger and been able to parlay that into a nomination. It remains to be seen where he can get the election or not. I wouldn't rule him out, but I think that's what we're seeing.
Okay, enough of that. Moving on gently. I noticed this this thing from Facebook. Talking about, amongst other things, OC's and running through the figures, I was slightly startled to find that the UK spends 0.71% of GDP on overseas aid, and the States spends 0.17%. Is this a reflection of the idea that charity should be communal rather than public here, and in the States that it should be individual rather than communal?
I think almost certainly. I mean, most of the giving in this country, and this country gives a lot, comes from donations to organizations and donations directly from individuals as opposed to going through the government itself. Our government doesn't feel much need to give corporately, other than the fact because it knows that people will give individually.
Yeah. Now I understand what I saw that comment that you'd written, and I now understand it.
Yeah.
I think it's very difficult to translate that in terms of a country thing. Because a lot of people in this country are quite willing to support a project if they have the avenue. And they don't. The government, and that I think historically the government would never go into a charitable type funneling. You know, we have enough NGOs to take care of that. And I think that the historic separation of church and state sort of drives that kind of and says it's up to you, the individual, if you find a project you want to support.
Okay.
I would add to that one thing, if I may. in terms of charity, I think you can have individual charity. I think you can have individual and corporate giving. I don't really think you can have corporate charity, at least not at the governmental level. The fundamental nature of charity is I see somebody in need, I choose to help them. Goes away when the government says you will pay us, the government, a certain amount of money, and then we will make the decision with other people's money of who gets it. I think you can call it giving. I don't think it falls into the category of charity.
I don't think it comes in the category of charity with our government either, because it's very much targeted to secure some national advantage in a lot of cases, rather than actually aimed at relieving problems. Though, to be fair, quite a lot of it does go in that direction as well. Our government, for instance, gives fairly lavishly to things like tsunami relief in other areas of the world, and is giving a lot to help house refugees from the Syria conflict, although a part of that is almost certainly self-interest in that we'd prefer them stay in Turkey rather than proceed into Europe at this point.
Also, in terms of what you just said, Chris, when there's, say, a tsunami or an earthquake,
yeah,
there is the individual who responds. In the case of the Methodist Church, UMCOR automatically comes up with a directed, if you want to support, here's the relief number to use.
Yeah.
The government's response on something like that is oftentimes military, the good kind, for the lack of a better term, good military aid, where they bring in the logistics, and I don't think that would show up in any kind of statistical study, because it's it's the military providing the logistics to get the aid that others have gathered to the site. And internally in the United States, you've got the National Guard, and I would think that's part of the military budget, so it doesn't show up in the same in the conversation.
Yeah.
Okay. Moving gently on from there, Elgin threw up a link to 37% of US high school seniors are prepared for college math and reading. Would you like to expand on that, Elgin?
Well, we had some conversations in recent weeks about the state of American education, which is actually it's spotty. There are some places that are just quite excellent. There's some places that are absolutely horrible, but overall, it's pretty bad. And as someone who has taught entry-level college courses, a lot of those end up dealing with remedial subjects like English. How do you write a paper? Kids are coming out of high school and they just don't know how to do that. And so it's a mark of the sorry state of education and we've been dealing with this for decades now, and essentially we've had generations of kids pass through our schools, and they only seem to get worse and worse year after year.
It's interesting that, because here, if anything, the issue is that grades seem to be inflating over the years. Whereas when I took my A-levels, which is, the age ranges are slightly odd between here and the States, but here you take A-levels at around age 18. So I don't know which level that equates to.
Roughly graduating high school here.
Yeah.
Okay. In my day, you used to be able to get into a decent university with 3 grade Cs or thereabouts. These days, 3 A's is not sufficient. You want 3 A stars, which is a better than A classification that they had to invent because too many people were getting A's. So it seems we have a different issue here. Is there a disconnect between high school and college going on?
Yeah, well, high school is where the problem primarily is. Most colleges, although there are certainly some exceptions, but most colleges still try to maintain standards, although there's a limit as to what they can do. I know I've taught for a college here, a private college called Rasmussen, and our target are essentially, we actually target people who wouldn't make it in a normal college environment, and we give them a lot of remedial training, we give them a lot of support, and we end up with a placement rate, not just graduating people out with nice grades, but we end up with a job placement rate in the field of about 85% or so of the people who graduate from our college actually get placed in jobs in the field that they studied for. So we actually do a fairly good job of that. But it varies. There are diploma mills that you pay the money, they give you the diploma, and it's just very wide-ranging problem here.
What you have from the standpoint of my classroom experience, plus being a parent, and laughing that my youngest daughter, who's now a classroom teacher, totally understands what I went through. There was this tendency of social promotion, which got eliminated. Then there became, the thing about the 80s and the 90s and the early in this century is that there was some concern about what the children were learning. And the problem for me, especially when I was in the high school classroom, was that the classroom teacher was having to deal with a lot of other issues that had absolutely nothing to do with the classroom. And it was transforming the classroom into the day experience into a babysitting service. Now, when I graduated from high school in '68, I wrote 2 papers my senior year. Actually, I'm very proud of the fact that I got a D in English, or my college, the one college term paper I had to write, I got a D on it, but I got it from a Pulitzer Prize winner.
Yeah.
Now, that affected me later on. I had to make up that. I had to solve that problem later on. But hey, this D, I earned this D, and he said it was a good paper, which I could have used, because the way things worked out, I could have actually used that paper in high school, because I took the courses in reverse order. I didn't do any writing at all on my master's, and that was '75. Now 1990, I'm at Iowa, and I'm writing a paper every week. I had one course where I had 16 papers to write. I learned how to write. Writing is a very difficult subject. Writing a paper is a very difficult subject to teach in a system that requires numbers. 0 to 100. It's very, so it's let's just go with, let's go with that. It just falls back to what the problem with the schools today is. It's fall back to what we are able to test. You cannot test writing a paper, so therefore we won't study writing papers. This is my take on it, but they coming out, they're not able to, then the technology. We did a science experiment one time with a Van de Graaff generator, and we found a willing victim to stand on the insulated platform, put their hands on the generator, and let their hair go out. Mad scientist.
Yeah.
and everybody's got their cell phone and they're snapping pictures. Great. Now, put the picture in your lab report. How do I do that?
Yeah.
And they talk about the students being technologically literate in that they can use a cell phone. My 9-year-old granddaughter knows how to hack into my Netflix account.
Yeah.
Well, I fixed that. I changed the password on her.
No.
But the stuff that we really want to be used in real life isn't being taught because our model doesn't allow it.
Okay.
Well, there's also, I would say there's kind of a chicken and egg problem here, in the sense that there was a marked decline in education, and the marked decline in education spawned an interest in how do we get kids to learn more, and that's where a lot of the testing comes in, because the problem was kids were coming out and they didn't know anything.
Yeah.
Nowadays they would have considered knowing a lot, but then the problem was, how do we ensure that children know? And that's where a lot of the standards come in, but the standards have been counterproductive. I mean, a lot of these have come down. For example, this period of decline has also been marked by the time that we've had a Department of Education. I would say the Department of Education has done very little, in fact, nothing. If anything, they've made things worse. We know how to fix the problem. The problem is actually fairly easy to fix. Charter schools, giving parents choice, that works. It works in upper levels. It works in inner city levels. When they put charter schools in the inner cities, the kids do really well. I was reading about one just the other day in charter school in an inner city where 95% of the children went on to college after coming out of that school. The problem is there's too few charter schools, and there's too many kids trying to get into them. So they literally have lottery systems where 1 in 7 of the kids who try to get into one of these schools can get in. Yeah. And if we had more of them, then we wouldn't have, parents could pick the schools that work, and they could avoid the schools that are problems. They could also pick the schools that are best for their children, because different children have different learning styles. And if you put a smart kid into a school that has a style of learning that conflicts with what they want to do, they're not going to succeed very well. And the best person to make that choice is the parent.
Can I clarify a couple of things? What exactly do you mean by a charter school? Because terminology differs.
Yeah. Essentially, what happened here is as schools declined, also, quite frankly, there was a cultural issue as they began pushing, sex education and things like that. Parents who disagreed with what was being taught pulled their kids out into public school or private schools. That worked kind of well. There's an explosion of private schools in the 70s and into the 80s, but that was limited by the fact that people couldn't afford to pay the taxes to pay for the public schools and then also pay for a private school as well. So you got the private school movement the homeschool movement, and throughout the 80s and in the 90s and up to today, you have a very vibrant and growing homeschool movement. Some would call it even the unschool movement, which provides a way for schooling. In response, a number of school districts have tried to attract these people back into the public school system by allowing people to come in, set up what is effectively a private school, but it's chartered by the school district, and they're allowed to have so many of them so that they get a charter that they are able to they're able to receive the government funds as a school as if they were public school, but they're essentially a private school with very little rules and controls.
Yeah, it's either a private public school or a public private school.
Yeah.
That gives me a slightly better idea. And are you saying that parents in general don't otherwise have the choice of where to send their children?
School districts,
not unless they're rich.
Yeah, in that case,
'Cause we
Other than the fact that I disagree with the concept of a charter school simply because of my own background and my own wherewithal.
Yeah.
But when my daughter was teaching in the Kansas City metropolitan area, she was actually teaching in Independence, Missouri.
Yeah.
Her district, there was the major issue with her district was trickle over from the Kansas City district. The parents were trying to sneak their kids into the Independence district because of the nature of the Kansas City district.
Which schools were better?
We have had here, at least in theory, freedom to choose schools within a broad district, at least, for quite some time. And if a school starts getting really, really terrible results, it will not get children applying to it. It will also, under our system, if it gets really, really bad results, fairly quickly have interventions which may replace the head teacher, may replace all of the staff, put it in special measures until it improves, and that happens not infrequently over here. So we do not anymore get really failing schools.
I know in New York
we tend to reward failing.
They're doing something like that.
I was gonna say, we tend to reward failing schools by giving them bigger budgets. It seems to be always the answer is they don't have enough money, and therefore if they're failing, we give them a bigger budget to waste even more money. And like I said, if it worked, great. But we've been seeing this decline for decades now, and to me, it's how many generations of kids are we going to sacrifice as we try to somehow fix this problem when we know something that will work.
Well, I would respond with two things. First of all, in a given district, oftentimes the schools that have I don't have the statistics to back it up, but I do know how hiring works. A school that's got the rookie teachers, the ones that don't have are just learning how they've done all the right stuff, but now they're in the classroom for the first time in their life without a mentor. They get the low schools. They get the schools nobody wants. And if they've got the drive and the wherewithal and possibly have a mentor, they will succeed. But most of them don't, and the school suffers. Now, second, and this is true in science and mathematics, in the 60s, when monies were poured into the school systems, especially in science and mathematics, they were poured in for experimental work. Monies were given so that you could do real science. And I think we saw a lot of gains there. But as money started to dry up, coincidentally, as the Vietnam War started to become a monster in our cosmic nightmare, then the money dried up. In sciences, experiments are always the first thing that are cut because those are consumables. Textbooks are never cut. The last high school I taught in New York had textbooks on the active book list that my father studied in the 1930s. I recommended they take those away because not only that, they were wasting storage space. But you cut experimentals, then you cut supplies, and you're left with textbooks. You cannot learn science and mathematics as a textbook study.
Yes.
If money, if we would do two things, we would reward the experienced teacher who's willing to go into the combat zone, if you will. I put quotes around that in the transcript. Get them to focus on it. And then also make the classes focus on the higher levels of learning, not just get by. I spend in my tutoring during the week. I've got one student right now. He's got a month and a half, 2 months about a month and a half of school left, we're going over the Regents exams. We're prepping for the Regents exams. Because that is what's going to determine his grade.
Yes, of course.
You know, I tell the parents, I say, I'm going to teach him how to think. I'm going to teach him how to get through the problem. You know, because that's more important. And I guarantee, you know, if they do it, you know, yes, I'm bragging. If they do it my way, they will get a good score on the Regents and they'll get a good grade, and they will actually know something.
My issue with things like charter schools is that here our ideologically driven conservative government has pushed some similar things which they call academies, which are basically privately run and tend to be run by chains. And there's been a litany of failing academies and academy chains going into receivership and just saying no, we can't do it anymore recently. So I am really very much against the idea of extending private provision in that, and very much in favour of improving government control through inspections and swift action if schools are failing.
Well, if that would work here, I would probably be a lot more open to it. But what we see here is we've heard that line. I mean, I've heard that line since the 70s. That if we support choice, if we allow kids to choose public or private wherever they want to go to, that will be taking money away from public schools. The problem is why they keep pouring more and more money, and per pupil spending has been going up ever since. And per pupil spending tends to be the highest in the areas where education is the worst. Still, we see a decline overall, and so if you want to spend the money in the classroom, and that's actually one of the big problems, is though even though per pupil spending is going up, the actual money spent inside the classroom is been declining. It goes to administration and bureaucratic layers of government. Whereas
I think I said that 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, whereas we have these charter schools that we are proven successful, and kids really struggling, because most of the public school or the charter schools I know of, in fact, virtually all of them, they're required to take anybody from any economic background, whatever. They get this huge list, and then they do a lottery where they literally pick 1 in 7, 1 in 10 kids actually get to go into the school. And you know, we see something working, we see something failing. For me, it's pretty easy. Let's go with something working. If your academy schools are failing, that's a good reason to dump the academy schools and go with something that works. Because my bottom line is, I don't want to spend another 2 or 3 generations of kids going uneducated while we kind of bounce around and try and come up with this somehow ideal system when we know it works.
Couldn't agree more. I'm comparing notes between our respective education systems might work both ways, rather than our government just looking at yours and thinking, oh, that looks like a good idea. Anyhow,
it may not work there.
It may not work.
It works here, but it may not work there.
Indeed.
The difficulty in our society today is we see a plan working somewhere, so we immediately copy that plan for our locality without considering why is it working there. You know.
Okay.
Quick example for me would be University of Texas in the early 70s came out with what was called the wishbone offense. It was a great offense. It dominated college football for close to 15 years. So coaches would take the wishbone offense and they'd run with it. But it required a good fullback. If you didn't have a good fullback, you were SOL. This is a great program. I'm going to use it. I don't have the personnel. It ain't going to work. If you see a system that works, I agree that if a system works, but find out why that system's working before you try to implement it in your system, because it may not work with what you've got.
And I think the decision as to whether it's working or not should be left to the parents. If they're sending their kid to a school and the school is working for their kid, great. If the school's not working for their kid, maybe it works for a lot of other kids, but maybe their kid learns differently and has a different outlook.
I'm not going to argue with you there. I would love
should be allowed to send them someplace else.
I would love it if parents got involved.
I think on that rare note of unanimity, I'll mention that we've got to the halfway point, and if anybody wants to hawk their books or websites, this would be an opportunity. I will be mentioning blog posts from both of you in a few minutes' time, though. So.
Works for me.
Okay, well, I'm Elgin Hushbeck, and I've written 4 books for Energeon Publications, 2 on religion and 2 on politics, and you can find them at the website.
Super. There was just one little snippet that I had left from the first half. There is now a method which at the moment I know is prohibited in the States, which hasn't actually been done here but might well be in the near future, where you have a mother suffering from mitochondrial disease. There is the prospect of a test tube baby with 3 parents by effectively replacing the nucleus of a donor egg with genetic material from the mother and obviously sperm from the father. This gets you about, I don't know, 5% of the DNA ends up being from the donor mother at that point. Some religious people have been getting rather excited about that. I notice over here, on the basis that this is wholly unnatural. Has this raised any concern your side of the pond?
I haven't. I mean, I've seen it mentioned. I haven't seen it. It's certainly not a very big issue. I mean, I would have to know more details. I would suspect. I know a number of people have problems with in vitro fertilization because it fertilizes a large number of eggs, and they end up implanting just one, or sometimes 2, and they get twins or whatever. And then the rest are thrown away. And of course, depending on when you believe life begins, that's definitely going to be an issue. I would suspect there's probably some of that here that's probably carrying over, but I don't know enough about the details of the medical process to know exactly what the objections would be.
I will admit it's a biology topic, so it kind of gets shunted to the side because that's not an area for me. I was thinking as Elgin was talking, I believe there was a court case where the eggs were set up and they were frozen and they were in storage, and then there was a divorce. And who got custody of the eggs?
Yes.
I think the mother, if I remember the case correctly, the mother wanted to have the eggs and have children, and the father was saying, "Wait a minute, I don't want to be made a father with that."
Something like that.
There's some. When we get into these areas, we look at the technology and we go, "Ooh, that's interesting." What we don't often I don't pay attention to is the secondary and tertiary ramifications of how is this all going to work out in certain cases. I mean, can the woman, for example, decide I'm going to have another child, and since this was done with my former husband, I'm going to sue him for child support?
Yes.
Well, and the whole nature of genetic testing on the whole. Genetic testing is a good thing. But who gets to know how much is public information? You know, how many times can what is Tay-Sachs? Is that I'm thinking the one that jumps to mind is Tay-Sachs disease. It's a genetic. I believe it's an Eastern European Jewish genetic disease. Now that I'm doing this off memory, so.
Yeah.
Does knowledge of that determine whether or not you know, if you want to have children, how do you have children if you know that natural childbirth, the natural child process, is going to cause a problem?
Yeah.
It's like
or take the other issue of, you know, if you can determine the sex of the baby in time to have an abortion. This is a huge issue in China where they now have a lot more men than they have women, and you know, how does society deal with such an imbalance? So.
Okay, moving onwards.
What I might say also is, instead of, I'm trying to phrase this right, instead of just simply raising religious objections, the religious community should be providing the ethics basis. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Discussion oftentimes gets heated because we don't understand the basis on what we're making our decision on.
Onward. Right, you have both recently written blog posts about minimum wage. Tony blogs at Heart on the Left WordPress.com, and Elgin was writing for the Energy Discussion Network. Elgin, you were suggesting that minimum wage was a terrible idea.
It is. I think the concept of a minimum wage, it depends on how you. Minimum wage is a fairly neutral term, and so that's okay. I get concerned if when they start calling it a living wage, because I don't think a minimum wage was ever meant to be a living wage. More accurately, is what it's supposed to be is a starting wage. It's what you start out as, and the stats are very clear. Very few people in America actually make the minimum wage. It's like 1.3 million, if I remember correctly. I have the stats in my article, if I believe, out of over 100 million people. So about 1% of the people actually make minimum wage. And when you raise the minimum wage, it gives some benefit to the person who gets the higher wage increase, but a lot of that's going to be offset by inflation caused by all, because that's, you lower the minimum wage, all the wages above it tend to ratchet up a bit. Where the real harm comes in is when you start dealing with the people that get laid off because the employer can no longer, they had 3 people, now with the wage going up, they can only hire 2. Or the business owner goes out of business and all 3 people plus the business owner, 4 people, are out of work. There's also another damage part of it, which is the people who can no longer get a job. Think of all the people out there who, is it better that they not get a job, they not learn how to work and learn, work skills, or being able to show up on time and work diligently it's a skill that people need to learn, and they never get that chance. They never, the older you get without getting a job, the harder it is to get into the job market. Is it really better that we keep those people locked out of the job market because if their skills are worth $11 and we have a $12 minimum wage, chances are they won't find a job. So I think when you look at the focus on just the person getting the wage, then there's, you can see the tugging of the heartstrings to say this person should get more money. But when you look at all the other people that it damages, it's really a big loser in my mind.
And Tony, you disagree with that?
Oh, well, I'm sitting here knowing the number of part-time jobs that are in this area alone. And I know that some of them are high school kids, but I also know that a lot of them are young adults, middle-aged adults. When I worked over the Christmas holidays, the people that I was working with were 25 to 50 years old, and we were making what was I making? I was making 12 something an hour, plus the shift differential.
Mhm.
What I'm thinking, what it looks to me as is, and the living wage, the minimum wage is, a set floor, and it's what, $7.50, $8.25 an hour, something like that. If that's the only income I've got, and if I can get a 40-hour work week, then I'm, $8 an hour, 40 hours a week. That's $320. That's $12.80, just a shade under $1,300 for the month. My rent, how much am I going to pay for my rent? And how much am I going to pay for, if I've got any money left, groceries? Personal, I had root canal surgery the other day, and now I'm going to be paying that. I don't have a hefty, a good insurance program, and even if I did, it doesn't have dental. The idea of the living wage focuses on where the person is living at the time and saying this is what it takes, this is the minimum amount of income that you have to support yourself or your family in this area. And in this area of New York, we're roughly 70 miles north of New York City, the living wage range is about $15 an hour. It's a range, and I'm doing that off my memory. And that's, I can see the argument, oh, this is going to hurt. But I also see if I'm going to hire this person, I want them to work. I want them to focus on working for me. I don't want them to come to my work site having, well, case in point, one of the guys I worked with was actually working 2 jobs the way our shift worked. He was working 2 jobs, one during the first half of the week and another at the second half of the week, and sometimes he was getting a call from the other job to go there after he came off his shift at 11:30 or 3 o'clock in the morning, rather. I don't want someone coming to work after coming off a second shift because they needed the income, and now they're dead tired. They're not going to work the best for me. That's my thinking. I understand where Elgin's coming from, but I'm thinking in terms of the fact that when you're working to provide you're trying to do the best you can, and you're trying to you're not trying to get wealthy. I don't think the only person I think who thinks they're going to get wealthy flipping burgers in a McDonald's is a person who wants to become a manager and move up the corporate chain.
There are a lot of people in this country who are on minimum wage, who are generally people in hospitality and catering. A lot of service staff in restaurants and lower-end kitchen staff, for instance. Huge numbers of them, and a lot of them are not necessarily young people. However, our minimum wage only applies to people over 25. Below that, you can pay them what the market will bear. So the point about letting people in at the bottom has been taken on board there. Even our Conservative government is currently in the process of increasing minimum wage progressively towards what's being calculated as, quote, a fair wage, which is one which is calculated as being able to allow a single person to live for the week on a 40-hour week. And we are in Europe. We have European working times regulations. You are not allowed to force somebody to work more than 40 hours a week, which I think is entirely correct there. from my point of view, if you can't pay a tolerable rate for the work doesn't really need to get done. Or you are not paying enough for this. It really should not be the case that that a worker cannot afford to live on the only wages they can get. This you mentioned something last week, Elgin, which where you were saying that Liberals tended to regard things as a moral issue. I do regard this as a moral issue, but I regard it as a moral issue in terms of society, not necessarily in terms of the individual. I accept that people get caught up in competitive situations where other people are paying rock bottom wages and they don't feel they can afford to pay more, though I'm not entirely sure that that the argument holds good. Your Henry Ford, for instance, decided that he should pay his workers an awful lot more than any other workers in a comparable job, on the basis that he thought his workers should be able to afford his products, which most of the people in catering here can't. Do you not think that this is actually a moral issue, Elgin?
I do actually think there's a definite moral component to it, but I'm not looking at just the person lucky enough to get the $15 an hour wage, which is the main proposal here. I'm also looking at the person who gets fired and his wage goes to zero because he no longer has a job. I'm also looking at the people who can't get a job because, I mean, right at the moment in the United States, our labor participation rate is the highest it's ever been since the 70s, and at that time, most women didn't go to work. Mm-hmm. So what we're finding is an ever larger growing of the population that cannot get a job. I mean, since Obama's been in office, one of the things that troubles me is, yes, the unemployment rate has gone down, but it's gone down each month, except for I think 2 or 3 months out of the 7 years he's been in office. It's gone down because more people gave up looking for work than actually found jobs. Oftentimes at a 4-to-1 times. I remember looking at one particular month, it was 800,000 people gave up looking for work, 200,000 found a job. That was counted as 1 million people off the unemployment rolls. So they counted, that gets calculated as declining employment. So we have a huge problem with underemployment. We have a few problems with chronic unemployment, people who haven't been able to get a job in years. And raising the minimum wage will only add to that problem. You mentioned burger flippers. One of the things that a lot of the fast food chains who flip burgers, one of the things they're looking at is automation. They're looking at automation both in the front counter, they're looking at automation back in the kitchen. And this is going to be a huge issue because, you can. I remember hearing the president of Carl's Jr., which is one of the firms. They've experimented with automation in certain areas near college campuses. The millennials like it. In fact, he mentioned going into one restaurant, people were standing in line at the automated order placement while people were standing not doing anything at the counters. So if our goal is to take the lucky few who still have a job and say we feel good because we give them a living wage and ignore the people who don't get a job or who lose their job, and now we haven't mentioned the businessman who loses his work, stores that go out of business, restaurants go out of business, which happened in Seattle. There's a lot more to this, and then there's a whole other side of the equation, which is the people who purchase this material. What good does it do to give a person a higher wage if all the prices go up and they're basically right back to where they were?
Do the prices have to go up? I remember the Carl's Jr. guy saying that he would automate it if they raised the rates. What's he do? What was his goal? His goal wasn't work. His goal was to keep the profit margin. You look at the I can understand the argument that is made that says if I raise my wage, I've got to raise my price. Well, why are you raising your wage?
Or cut your labor costs.
Keep your profit, so you can keep your profit margin. And that's part of the moral issue too. In the Carl's Jr. case, if I'm not mistaken, his comment about going to automation had nothing to do with the price of the employees were making. He wanted to keep his bottom line, and I almost put a word in there before it starts with an F. He wants, that's greed. Everybody who has argued against the profit of argued against a minimum wage or even a living wage has wanted to keep the bottom line for themselves. McDonald's is starting to raise the price.
For example,
I
have stats in my blog post. I have stats in my blog post that lists the 22 top retailers. They made a total profit of, I'm going off memory here, of $36 million. They employ 5.8 million employees, which works out to about $6,000 an employee. If you raise the minimum wage to $12, they will lose $1,000 per employee. If you raise it to $15 an hour, they will lose $6,000 per employee. That's just simple math. A business that doesn't make a profit goes out of business, and so all the jobs get lost.
Well, like I said, I'm reacting to the Carl's Jr. CEO, and my interpretation of his comments were that he wanted to keep the bottom line. And
he goes out of business.
By the way, have you eaten a Carl's Jr. hamburger?
Yeah,
I have.
Had one a couple weeks ago.
They're not
called Hardee's in my area.
Yeah, it's a regional thing, but
Well, the Carl's Jr. in Southern California, where Carl Culture started the business, but I believe he bought out Hardee's, and therefore, in most of the United States, they're called Hardee's.
Okay.
I've got to say, I'm very skeptical of these arguments that businesses are going to go out of business. A lot of people predicted when one of our governments first brought in a minimum wage that people would be able to work left, right and centre, that businesses would go under, and none of that actually happened. And prices didn't go up that horrendously either. Yes, some of it did get passed on, but in conscience, I do not want to get served by a business whose employees are not paid a wage on which they can live. That is equivalent to me to patronising a business that uses slave labour. It is exactly the same, merely a matter of scale. You pay the slave nothing, you pay people who are below a fair wage peanuts, but it might as well be nothing in a lot of cases.
Yeah, I'm in agreement, Chris, and I look at companies like Walmart, which many of their, from what I read, Walmart is getting a massive tax break in return, whereas if they were to raise the minimum wage, they would eliminate some of the workers at Walmart are forced onto food stamps simply because of the wage. And it's it's very interesting because our military, what we pay our enlisted personnel, a lot of the families, I'll make this comment: an enlisted man has no business having a wife.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when I was in, we used to refer to it as you don't get issued a wife until you're a sergeant.
Yeah, but they have children. The enlisted personnel have families, and they're on food stamps. And I find that incredulous. I also find it quite normal that we don't treat our military like we should. And I was thinking about that, what you just said, Chris, during the week, of the number of, there's an old Tennessee Ernie Ford song, 16 tons.
Mm-hmm.
And the chorus line is, Peter, don't you call me because I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store.
Yeah.
there were so many sharecroppers in the South, in the coal mining industry in the South, in the Appalachia area, where the company took care of you.
Yeah.
But they charged you an obnoxious amount for your groceries, for the company store. Your home was a company home,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and I've seen it.
Mm-hmm.
And the store owner or the company owner can say, "Well, I'm benefiting my employees and giving them everything they got them in slavery." It's legalized, but it's slavery.
Well, it's illegal here. You can't do that any longer since the
well,
early 1900s.
Yeah, you can't do it any longer above board. I'm still not convinced it's not done somehow.
Well, that something is done. I mean, murder still happens. We have laws against murder. So, I mean, that's not an argument for getting rid of laws against murder.
Yeah. No, I'm not making.
The thing is I'm not objecting to saying these people should have better paying jobs. My point is you can either look at this as artificially increasing the wage, which if you do that, you're not adding any value. So there's no wealth created. That's got to come from someplace. And there's this myth, and it is a myth, that business owners are just wealthy business owners that, sitting on big piles of money while their people starve and they're not paying them a living wage. The simple fact is the vast majority, something like 80% of all workers in the United States at least, work for small businesses. And most small business owners are struggling themselves. They're not super wealthy. And the ones who are doing fairly well, like restaurant owners, they usually have 2 or 3 or 4 restaurants because each individual restaurant will only turn a profit of about $25,000, which is, this is one of the problems you're having in Seattle where they just raised their rates to $15 an hour, and they're seeing a lot of restaurants close. Because if your restaurant only makes $25 or $25,000 a year, and suddenly you've got 30 or 40 employees whose wage is effectively close to double, where's that money come from? I would much rather see government focus on what allows businesses to grow, what allows businesses to get in there, because quite frankly, most small business owners plow their money back in their business to keep it solid so they can get through the lean times.
I think
most business owners I know, the small ones, have, including myself, have had times when I could not pay myself because I had to pay my employees and my bills and my taxes first. And after paying all that, there wasn't any money for me. The government doesn't come to me and say, well, this is what you could keep, as a minimum wage and then pay your taxes after that. No, they want their taxes first. Then if I have any money left over, I get to keep it myself.
I have to admit, I've been in exactly your situation, Elgin. One class of people to whom minimum wage doesn't apply are self-employed. And generally speaking, they do not get the benefit of the other thing, which, as we've seen in the case of Walmart, big time, is if you do not pay a living wage to your employees, eventually the government has to step in and the public generally have to pay for them. That is just immoral. That is corporate welfare. Shouldn't happen.
Well, you again come back to the fact that if a job is worth a certain amount of money, because if I can build a widget and sell it to somebody for a price, because the other aspect of this is what is people willing to pay? You say you're willing to pay higher prices, but Walmart stays in business because they provide goods at lower prices than other stores, and people who are on minimum wage like to shop there because that's where they can get the things that they want at a price they can afford. And so there's a very complex equation going on here, and government coming in and saying artificially, we're going to take this one aspect and raise it up, I think causes more harm than it does good.
You can have a feedback loop in that direction, whereby they pay lower wages, so the only place they can afford to pay is somewhere that charges rock-bottom prices. You can also have a virtuous feedback loop, where employees are paid more so they can afford to pay more for better goods. And I personally much prefer the second of those. However, we have
Well,
run
so would
over
I,
time.
if you generate the value to do that.
Well,
Remember, in the United States, only 1.3 million people are actually on minimum wage. 130 million people are above minimum wage. And I would rather make it much easier for people to move up than to raise the ladder so people can't get into the system.
Mm-hmm. Onward and upward. We have run out of time for this week, so I will bid everyone farewell. Have a good week, and hope to see you this time next week.
and don't forget to call your mother this weekend.